session 2, and some of you will all know me now. I'm Joe, part of the double act of Stu and Joe, and I've had bees for 48 years now. They've very much been part of my life, so look forward to telling you about them. The sort of things we're talking about today are really some bread and butter issues, and it's the sort of information that you will find really useful. We don't expect you to be an instant expert to absorb this instantly, but it's to give you a rough feel for an important area of information. You've got to remember that people, can spend 3 years doing a PhD on just one of the topics on here. And so we can't sort of tell you everything there is to know, certainly not in one evening, but we perhaps could in one lifetime. But anyway, let's start. If you feel that you really must ask a question during the thing, if you press the space bar, I believe you will be, and hold it, you will be able to speak. I'd be grateful if we could manage it that we do questions at the end. And I think you've all had an email from Stu that if you have questions which are lengthy or which come to you after the sessions, then obviously you can either phone or email us and we can go through it sort of methodically. So the occupants of the hive, about the bees, who's in the hive, some elementary anatomy, the 3 castes in the colony. It's an unfortunate word, caste, because it's the 3 types of bees in the colony, but just to confuse you, we use the word caste for a different phenomena, for a small swarm as well.
Sorry,
so
Joe, we're not seeing your screen. We're only seeing you at the moment.
Sorry, so you're not seeing the slide presentation?
No.
I can see the screen.
the screen.
Yes.
I can see the screen.
Yeah.
I can see that.
Right, so does everybody feel that they can see the presentation, the PowerPoint presentation?
Yes.
Yeah,
I can.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, all okay. So Stu, how about you? Stu, can you actually see the PowerPoint presentation?
Yes, I can now, Joe. Thanks. Yep.
You can, right, okay. The 3 castes in a colony: the life cycle of the individuals and the life cycle of the colony itself. So, which honeybee? So, if we have a look here, this is the classic British black bee, and this was the bee that lived in the UK from the beginning of time till about 100 years ago. 100 years ago, there was a terrible epidemic which started in the Isle of Wight, and it was called the Isle of Wight disease, rather unimaginatively, and slowly it virtually wiped out all the British bees. During the First World War, the government were very, very worried about food security, and after the war they put a lot of money into importing foreign bees to make up the British bees. It's not really certain what the disease was, because we couldn't do work on viruses in the way we could now. And so there are other bees, and this one is Apis mellifera carnica, which tends to come from up in the Balkans. Apis mellifera linguistica, which very much comes from the area of Italy and adjacent to Italy. And so they were all brought in, and we ended up with what we've got now, which is a mongrel. It's very much a mix of all this genetic material. And that if we have a look on here, you can see this is a hive that's been opened up. And if you have a quick look, you can see there are bees there with all different gradations of colouring. And if you have a good look round, and you can see there's a great deal of diversity there. And so it's very much, we've got a mongrel bee in this country. So we're going to have a look at some anatomy. So bees are insects. So we call them insects because they have certain characteristics which they all share. They have an exoskeleton In other words, all the hard bits for us are inside, and we hang all the soft bits on the internal skeleton. But of course, they do it the other way around. But they've got an external skeleton, and all the soft bits are inside. And because obviously they've got to be able to move and flex, the exoskeleton is made up of a series of plates which can slightly move. They're not totally rigid, called sternites and tergites. And obviously the body is split into 3 sections: head, thorax, and abdomen. So here's our worker bee. It's got head, thorax, and abdomen. And if in fact you were to look, where it's not quite so clear on this slide, but there is a very distinct segmentation between those 3 parts. Actually, it looks a very, very splendid little bee. So we're going to have a look at the head first of all, and if we look at the parts, it's got 2 compound eyes. These are the big eyes at the front, and they are different from ours in that they're compound eyes, but there's something which we find it easy to relate to. And then they have 3 more eyes, and these are rather primitive, simple eyes, and they get called ocelli, and they're up on the forehead. And for quite a long time, people thought that they were just some primitive hangover, that they actually virtually performed no useful function, perhaps a little bit of perception of light, difference between light and dark. Although people noticed then that actually the nervous innervation that goes from the ocelli into the brain is very, very large. And it seems improbable that something which had no function anymore should then have a big nerve supply informing the brain. And in fact, they're used for pitch and yaw. If you think of a plane, it needs to know whether the nose is up or the nose is down, and also whether it's actually, you know, left wing down, right wing down. And so the 3 little ocelli, a lot of work is being done on the bee brain at the moment at the University of Western Australia, because the bee brain has only 1 million nerve cells in it, neurons. And the thing is that it's therefore a very simple brain, yet it manages to do these very complex tasks, especially flights. And people who are into developing robotics are very interested in how they do such a complex task without, you know, a much more complicated brain. So a lot of work going on. So it has these 2 antennae. If we have a look here, they're terribly important, and we'll see go into their function in a moment. Their proboscis there, which they suck up the nectar with, and whoops, and 2 pairs of wings.
Now you're on the thorax.
Oh, we moved. Sorry, I do apologize. We moved on to the thorax. So if we're looking at the thorax, the major feature is that it's got 2 pairs of wings and 3 pairs of legs. To be an insect, you have to have 3 pairs of legs. And so, you know, actually, if you're a spider with 8, you can't be an insect, believe it or not. You have to call yourself something else. So anyway, 3 pairs of legs. And the vast majority of the thorax, this middle part, is made up of flight muscles. It's just full of muscles, which obviously is terribly important with for flight. And the next thing is we've got the pollen baskets on the back legs. Now these are very important. When it's flying along, it needs to carry all the pollen that it's collected. And in fact, it's a slightly misleading term to call them pollen baskets, but you can see all those little hairs along there. And when they collect the pollen, they collect it, they get it off their fur and what have you with the front leg. The front legs pass it to the middle legs, and they work it into a nice little bundle, and then they can pass it back and stick it on those hairs. And pollen, when it comes from a flower, usually is a little bit moist with nectar, and therefore it makes a nice bundle very, very easily. And if the bees happen to be foraging on a plant which doesn't have any nectar, any stickiness, they can fly out with a little bit of nectar or honey in their crop, and they can actually provide it for themselves. So let's have a look at the abdomen. So here we've got the Nasonov gland. Now, between these two segments here, there's a little space, and you're going to see this later on. And underneath is a gland called the Nasonov gland. Mr. Nasonov was a Russian researcher, and the Nasonov gland is very important, and you will see it because it gives off a pheromone. And the pheromone basically tells the bees in the area, this is home, this is where you should be. This enables you to find your way home. And as you would expect, the poor old bee has got an anus, and she's got a sting. So you will come to know and love the sting, because believe it or not, however hard you try and however hard we try for you, you will occasionally get stung. So you have to accept that and be philosophical. And under the tummy, between the plates again, are the glands which produce wax. And obviously wax is the building material that they build the whole of the colony. And so wax glands are very, very important. And here we have something which is very different from us. The spiracles, a row of they're like little holes, perforations actually through the armor plating of the exoskeleton, and they lead to tubes which permeate throughout their body. They actually get oxygen to all the internal parts of the body by diffusion, whereas we have a complicated system of lungs and what have you, and all the blood vessels. This is much, much simpler. And it actually means that because oxygen can only diffuse a certain distance, that actually it's why insects in the main are rather small, that you can't have a gigantic. So, and we move on to talk a little bit about internal organs. So here you can see this, it's superimposed on the body. Obviously it's inside. You can see this is some a rather strange by our sight's blood vessel. And believe it or not, whereas we have one heart with 4 chambers, they actually have several hearts, which in a fairly passive way do pump a little bit. They just keep the blood, which is called hemolymph, on the move around the body. And also particularly when they're using their flight muscles and their thorax is contracting and expanding, that again helps move the things on. So, and this, to give you the name, we've got the dorsal blood vessel, and in here there are ovaries. Now this is a worker bee, so because of the way it's fed when it's a larva, its ovaries haven't really developed, and normally except under very unusual circumstances, that it won't produce eggs. So its ovaries are very shriveled up, whereas the queen, who, as we'll see later on, may be laying perhaps up to 2,000 eggs a day, obviously she's got very, very large ovaries, and therefore her abdomen is rather larger, as you'll see in a moment. And down here we've got the crop, the honey stomach, that when the bee actually sucks up some nectar through its proboscis, it can store it here. And there's quite an elaborate valve system here, which it means that they can contain it in the crop, and it can then be regurgitated, or it can pass in through its own digestive system. And surprisingly enough, there's the rest of the intestines. There's a rectum, an anus, as we've had before. And if we have a look here, we've got a ganglion. It's called and also, of course, you've got the sting mechanism here. So up at the front here, we've got the brain is tucked in there, a fairly unhelpful thing to say, but you know, it doesn't tell you a lot about a bee brain, but it is much smaller than, it's very efficient, but surprisingly small in terms of the number of neurons compared to some creatures. And so this is the ganglion of the central nervous system. And again, it's, I suppose, roughly speaking, the equivalent of our spine. And that down here, of course, we have a sting mechanism, which you'll come to know and love when you do some practical beekeeping. So let's have a look at the head from head on. So we said there's a proboscis, there are mandibles, that's jaws, there's antennae, and they are incredibly versatile little organs. They deal with touch, smell, hearing, communication, wind speed, and they have lots of little sensillas, the sensors in little pits on them, and some of them are specialized, and they provide all this information to the bees. And of course the old brain is there, which is quite reactive to stimuli. And there's some important glands. One is the hypopharyngeal gland, which produces the royal jelly and also an enzyme called invertase. Now, royal jelly is the super rich, nutritious food which the queen is especially fed, and it helps her to develop to be a larger bee with these very large ovaries, and also it actually nourishes her during her adult lifetime when she's laying eggs. And we'll see later on, it's not impossible for a queen to be laying anything up to 2,000 eggs a day, which is incredible. And the other thing that's important is invertase, which is an enzyme, and that breaks down sucrose, which is actually what they're collecting in nectar. And sucrose is called a disaccharide. In other words, it's really two sugars linked together. And with the invertase, the enzyme breaks them down into glucose and also fructose. And this is the basis from which they then develop honey. And they also have a mandibular glands, and one of its particular functions is to produce the alarm pheromone. So when they suddenly feel they're under attack, lots of alarm pheromone going off, and they can marshal the troops to repel invaders. And of course, as we've said before, there's the two compound eyes and the three ocelli. So if we have a look, and here we get a good chance to see the three simple eyes, the three ocelli, and you can see the compound eyes are pretty large. The antennae are here, and you've got the mandibles, and actually the tongue, which obviously which they use to collect nectar, and this is all the different parts of the proboscis. So a surprisingly simple but effective system. So our proboscis, what's it going to be doing? Well, it's handy for collecting nectar and water, and it's a two-way system. It collects it, and then it can, if necessary, regurgitate it for feeding larvae or storage, and it's used for collecting water, although funnily enough, water is seldom stored in a hive. Basically, if they're getting really hot in the summer and they've got to cool the inside of the hive down, then they will collect water and they will probably put it on the top bars on top of the comb, and they fan madly in the hive, and obviously the water evaporates as the effect of cooling down the whole system, because they want to keep the internal temperature of the hive within a comparatively narrow range. And also the proboscis, you must never forget, there are lots of cells in the honeycomb where the larvae, the young bees, are raised, and after one generation has been produced, they've got to be cleaned out and polished. and got fit and ready for the next generation, the next egg to be laid in it. So if we look at our thorax, you've got that central nervous system that we talked about, the ganglia. It's got its 3 pairs of legs, 2 pairs of wings, and most of the muscle system, as we were saying, the main muscle system is to do with flight. And so much of the thorax is made up of flight muscles, to the point that if ever you see bees being attacked by wasps or hornets, if they kill a bee, very often what you'll see them doing is they chop their head off, they chop their abdomen off, and they leave those bits and they fly off with the thorax, because that's all the protein, that's got all the muscle in it, which is really nourishing. So if we look at the legs, so at the front, they're very specialized. They're a little bit like a Swiss army knife. They got lots of gadgets on them which do useful things. On the front legs, there's actually a special notch which they can actually clean their antennae with and get any bits off. It helps them collecting up the pollen when they're foraging, but also where the antennae are so very important that they've got to be kept clean, because they've got all these sensory purposes. Yeah, so they're gathering the pollen and packing it into the pollen baskets. And as I say, those hairs on the back legs is where they transport pollen, and they transport propolis. And I'll just explain what propolis is. Well, in a moment, we'll get there. But anyway, here's our beautiful bee, beautiful worker bee, really nice photo, showing all those elements that we've just been talked about. And here's pollen being carried on the pollen basket. You know, particularly the spring coming up, if you see the bees, there seems to be an awful lot of yellow pollen in the spring, although there's quite a wide color range in pollen, and it's quite fun over the years as you see your bees, as they're foraging on different crops, you'll see the color of their pollen change color, and you can actually work out more or less what it is they're foraging on. So what is propolis? These are sticky buds. Some of you'll probably recognize them on their horse chestnut. And it's just to demonstrate the sticky resins that the bees can collect from trees and from buds. I'm not suggesting it's only from horse chestnut that they collect it, but there's just a good, easy way of showing you. And this sticky resin that they collect is very important within the hive, because bees, are tidy and neat, and they don't like small holes within the colony. If they like to have a hole which obviously they can move through, but if it's too small, they tend to want to block it up, and they collect the resin, the propolis, and they use that as a building material to fill up any gaps and holes. And also it has an advantage that it has a slight antibacterial effect. It's like a precursor of a fairly crude antibiotic. And certainly when I first started keeping bees back in the 1970s, there was quite a move that you could collect the propolis out of your hive and you could sell it to a company in Denmark. And if you were doing it on a big enough scale, you could make really quite a significant amount of money out of it. And I don't know what happened. All of a sudden, they just stopped trading. And I imagined it was probably something to do with EU regulations. Mm. So if we have a look, as we've said, if we look at, here's a bee, here's its rear leg, and whereas previously we've seen pollen on it, and most of the time you will see pollen on the pollen baskets on their rear legs, this one has got a really nice gooey drop of resin, and looking at it makes you wonder how they get it on and how they get it off, but they do. And it's a very useful building material within the hive. And beekeepers are a little bit equivocal about propolis. And here are two bits of the hive. It's the main box of the hive down here, and this is the crown board. the lid that goes over the top. And this is a hot summer's day, and it's a colony of bees, which obviously is really good at collecting and using propolis. And you can see it's been prized apart with some difficulty, and everything is stuck up with this great gooey mass of propolis, which can be mildly tiresome if you want to go in there and do a little bit of beekeeping. So we're going to talk about the abdomen. We've got the hearts, we've got ganglia, and that honey crop, which obviously is important, and all the digestive organs, and the respiratory system. As I say, it's all these little tubes that lead into the body, and oxygen diffuses through the walls of the tubes, the tracheoles, and disseminates throughout the body. And as I say, it's why bees are a certain size, because oxygen can only diffuse at a certain distance. And of course the wax glands, producing a really vital building material. And of course, in fact, wax production is a very energy intensive process. They have to have very, very big, sorry, our phone's going, so sorry that's slightly distracting me. My wife's going to deal with it. But they actually need a very high metabolic rate to produce wax. And they always say, you know, it takes several pounds of honey to produce a pound of wax. And of course, there are sexual organs as well. And the Nasonov gland, which we've talked about. And the sting, your best friend, the sting. So let's have a look at our wax glands. This is a bee. If you imagine you're looking under its tummy, so you can see your sting there, just to orientate you, and the glands are under those plates, those armor plates of the exoskeleton. And as they're produced, the wax is squeezed out between the plates in these thin little wafers of wax, and the bees then collect them. They mold it with the legs and also pass it to the mandibles, and then they can use it for building and produce the beeswax comb. So let's have a look at now this is something you've really been on the edge of your seat wanting to know. This is what the Nasonov gland produces. It gives a pheromone, and that's what's in it. Now you don't really have to know this, but we just put it in because it does draw attention to the fact that this is a fairly complex mix. And as I say, the Nasonov gland, the pheromone it gives off actually tells the bees, this is home, this is where you should be. And so it's a complex mix, and there are other pheromones in the colony doing other roles, and no doubt they are all also complex, but they are different, otherwise there'd just be endless confusion. And it has some significance when the bees are swarming, because obviously they're going to a new home, and the bees that arrive first, they actually then start fanning wildly, producing the pheromone from their Nasonov gland, and it helps all the other bees to find their way to the new site. And here's a bee doing it. You can see up here, they've got their bottom tilted over, and it exposes the Nasonov gland, and they're actually fanning like mad, and they're giving off the pheromone, and they're fanning, and that's actually, okay, so there we are. And there's the bee again. They shows particularly well the Nasonov gland, and it would be fanning and producing the pheromone. And here they are doing it en masse at the entrance to a hive, giving out that vital message, this is home, this is where you should be. And they've all got their bottoms in the air, Certainly when we were able to give the class as a live class, at this point I would always make a joke which made everybody really uneasy, because I would say, now look at this, get it right, because you're all going to be doing this in 5 minutes. We want you to stand on your chairs, stick your bottoms in the air and fan wildly and pretend you're a bee producing pheromone. And no one ever left when I made those comments, but they used to give me some fairly uneasy looks until they realized I was joking. So the abdomen, the sting. There's a bee that's just stung a human being. I think there's actually a second sting up at the top of the screen there, but you can see the bee has stung there. Now the sting has a barb on it, which means as the bee pulls away, it actually dislocates the end of its body. And so this poor bee is going to die. It's a worker that's going to die. It's, you know, actually broken off the end of its abdomen. And so, you know, there's no hope for it. But if we have a look at the sting, the important is it doesn't show it wonderfully well on this one. But if we move on, whoops. So that here you can see that there it goes. Now I want you to watch. Now that's a sac of venom on the top, and if you can see, it's pulsating, it's squeezing, and it's pumping venom into you. So when the magic moment comes, when someone gets stung, what you need to do is scratch it out as quickly as possible. So because you want as little venom in there as you can possibly manage.
Don't pinch that. Use the arrow to move it on.
So pulsing away, pumping in venom. Right, so here's a summary of our anatomy, all the things we've drawn attention to. They're all things which you don't have to know, but you would actually find useful, and you will probably tend to come to know, particularly obviously things like the external features. Now the casts, as I say, this is the different types of bees in the hive. Slightly confusing because we use the word also for a small late in the season swarm, but it's the 3 types of bees: the queen, the worker, and the drone. And they have different but interdependent roles. They're all structurally very substantially different. And the development times, the time it takes to produce each one of them, is significantly different. So the queen, mother of them all. So you may have heard the term a superorganism, and of course what it means is that whereas us as an organism, all our organs are all in one skin, and so we're all one functioning unit altogether, but actually certain insects, particularly the bees and also ants and similar things, they carry out, even though there's lots of individuals, they operate as one unit. And so that's that term you'll quite often hear of superorganism. With the queen, there's usually only one in the colony. There are times when there are more than one, but the vast majority of the time there is one. She's mummy to all the bees that are there. And she lays her eggs in cells, which the rest of the workers have built for her. And she might, in high season, lay 2,000 eggs a day. So it does put childbirth in perspective. This is what she's doing every day. And it's more than her own body weight in eggs every day. And in order to do this, obviously, she is really an egg-laying machine, She does nothing else for much of the year, and she is waited on the whole time. She has a much longer abdomen because obviously she's got ovaries. They're much bigger than the workers, and she's got to stretch down into the cell to put the egg on at the bottom of the cell. And so she needs that much longer abdomen. And on the end has a functioning ovipositor. It's something which enables her to position the egg in its optimum position right at the bottom. She has a sting, but she's got no barbs. So in other words, if she stings, she can sting again and again and again and again, and she doesn't dislocate the end of her body. But she only uses it against other queens, and she's not at all likely to sting you. I don't think I've ever met anybody who's been stung by a queen. There she is. Isn't she beautiful? And if you have a look where she's got this longer abdomen, here are her wings, and the end of her abdomen sticks well past her wings. You might say, what's she doing walking around with some egg custard on her back? And in fact, it's a marking system that if you've got 50,000 bees in a colony, it's helpful to be able to find the queen. And I think on the previous session, you probably remember, Stuart showed you how you can actually mark a queen quite simply. Each year has a different color. And this coming year, season that we're in, will be a white year. And so if there are new queens this year, the suggestion would be that you mark them white. You don't have to follow the system. And there's a little mnemonic. There are five colors, and here she is. So there's the queen. She's actually, here are all the cells, and her abdomen is down in a cell. She's laying an egg, and she's surrounded by these bees that they're waiting on her. They're feeding her constantly. They're feeding her this incredibly rich diet. And also, you'll probably spot that they're actually tending to lick her. And the reason for that is that she has given off another pheromone, and it's called queen substance. And basically that then gets disseminated throughout the hive, and it tells all the bees everything's all right. The queen's all right, everything's fine. You know, everything's just as it should be. And it's really important that that pheromone can disseminate around the hive. If, you know, for some reason you took the queen out of the hive and you put it in another box for a few moments, you'd find within a few minutes the bees would be herring about all over the place, desperate to find her, because they've noticed that the level of queen substance has dropped away. And here she is from the top, lovely looking queen, you know, looks absolutely beautiful. And right, we've got a video.
Every day, the queen will lay about 1,500 eggs, 200,000 in a year. It's a tough job, but someone has to do it. The queen's royal scent prevents the female workers from laying eggs themselves. It takes a few days for the eggs to grow into larvae.
So let's have a look at the worker. Now, these are the ones you've probably seen. They're out and about. Obviously, the queen very rarely ever leaves the hive. And even when she does, you're unlikely to see her. So, but you're very likely to have seen worker bees on the flowers collecting nectar and pollen. Depending on the time of year, there may perhaps be 10,000 or 50,000 in a colony. And the thing is that at this time of year, right in the depth of winter, the numbers are right at the very low level. And obviously, gradually they build up and increase in number over the summer. And you produce a worker bee by the queen laying a fertilized egg. Now you'd think, well, you know, of course she's going to lay a fertilized egg. But when we get to the drone, you will find that actually what makes a drone is the fact it actually lays an unfertilized egg. But for a worker, the queen lays a fertilized egg. So the worker has genetic material both from its mother and its father. But because of what they've been fed during the time that they were larvae, under most circumstances, the workers are infertile. Their ovaries haven't really developed. And there are a few extreme circumstances when in fact they can lay eggs, but of course they haven't been fertilized, so they produce drones. And but this is something when the queen has died, and it's a desperation event which leads to the collapse of the colony. So they can lay eggs, but the eggs aren't fertile. And their ovipositor is a sting. So if the moment comes when a worker does lay the odd egg, she tends to lay it all over the place in the cell, because obviously she hasn't got a long abdomen. And so the eggs, instead of being neat and upright and just right, they tend to be all over the place. So, and their sting has a barb, so it can't be used again. So, you know, a bee doesn't want to sting you, have to sting you, because of the effect is it's going to die. There she is. Very, very elegant. So here's the boys. At this time of year, there are no drones in the colony. They all get kicked out in the autumn to die, starved to death. And so there are none in the colony at the moment, but in the spring, they will start producing them. He's the male. And the queen lays an unfertilized egg. When the queen flies out to mate, what happens is she mates just on that one occasion, and she will probably mate with anything up to a dozen, perhaps 15 drones. And the sperm from the drones is then actually stored in a little organ in her body called the spermatheca. And the queen is able to allow each egg, if it wants a worker, to be fertilized by one of the sperm. But if it wants to lay a drone egg, it actually doesn't allow that to happen. And so the egg is actually laid, and it's unfertilized, and it will actually grow to be a drone rather than a worker. And it's only got half the genetic material that its sisters have got. It's larger, plumper. It's a bit of a Hell's Angel of a bee, really. It's got no sting, but it's got some wonderful eyes. If you have a look, here's a drone, head on. Can you see these whopping great eyes? And really, it's a flying sex machine. And so they've got to find the queens, the virgin queens, when they fly out to mate. So they've got to have big eyes and be powerful flyers. And obviously it's the most powerful drones that get to the front of the pack and successfully mate with the queen. And it's the less effective drones that fall behind and don't have the being one of the magic 15 that actually mate with the queen. It's a bit sad though, because of course, as they mate with the queen, they do get their genitals torn off and they drop to the earth and die. So it's a role not without its difficulties. And here we go. There's a very handsome picture of a drone looking particularly hairy. And compare one to a worker. Look at its massive eyes. It's a great big chubby chunky chap. Huge flight muscles. And here's one you can compare with the workers. So you've got the drone here, and you've got the workers you can compare it with. So say massive eyes, and it's really big and chunky. So we've got all three casts. So we've got the worker at the top, the queen in the middle, and the drone. When you first see a drone in a colony, you might think, oh, goodness me, goodness me. It's the queen. And then all of a sudden you see several more and you think, oh, it can't be because there's more than one. But one useful thing about making the difference is if you have a look, the queen's abdomen goes well past the wings, whereas in the case of the drone, it doesn't. And the drone does actually have a rather hairy bottom as well. So here's an egg. It's been laid in the cell. And when they're first laid, they stand up straight and they look very elegant. And over a period of time, takes 3 days, they flop onto their side. So it takes 3 days for the egg to hatch. And here's a nice slab of brood. And if we have a look here, you can see there's lots of eggs there. There's one there, one there, one there. And if we look on the other side, when the eggs have hatched, here's some larvae. This is perhaps the smallest one. And gradually, as they grow, they get bigger and bigger and bigger until they completely fill the cell. And you can see that each one is lying in a puddle of dinner, that they're very well fed. And these are beautiful, healthy looking larvae, lovely pearly white. The differentiation on them is very good. They're like lots of little Michelin men, you know, they've got all this differentiation, and they're in this nice regular posture that you can see they're curled up, snug as a bug in a rug, lying in a great pool of dinner, growing like mad. Oh, sorry about that. I don't think I can go back. I cut you off. I'll try and go back. Oh, whoops. Going back. There we go. Sorry about that. That was my fault. Here's the larvae hatching. I want you to keep an eye open. When we get them a bit older, you're going to see some varroa mites, some funny little crab-like creatures. I think the first one's the top left. Just keep an eye out for them. There they are. See them top left, one bottom. Gradually, as they continue to develop, they're metamorphosing. Here's one changed into adults. They're ready to come out, sticking their tongues out, probing the world. There's an adult bee worker cleaning out the cell, ready for the next one. So, and again, here's a lovely slide of some larvae at all stages, looking very, very nice. So on the 9th day, the larvae have got to pupate. They've got like a caterpillar has to change into a butterfly, a fundamental change, that it has to pupate. And so if you imagine the larvae are down here, and over the top, they build a layer, cappings, which is a mixture of wax, and also it's got pollen in. And the reason it's got that is that it allows oxygen to diffuse through. If you just cover them in wax, they would actually gradually suffocate and die. So the cappings have this distinctive biscuity appearance, a little bit like blotting paper in a way. And there are a few other useful things to see. Here you can see this is some pollen stored in one of the combs. And up the top here, there is some honey. This is honey that's complete. They've got the water content down to about 18%, and then they cap it over with a layer of wax, and that is their way of storing it. And obviously it's their rainy day store, but when they need it, it's there. This shows it particularly nicely. And there's this biscuity colored sealed brood. Under each one of those is a larvae, and it's pupating, it's changing into an adult bee. And if we have a look up the top here, this lovely white pristine wax is covering up some honey. What we like to see when we get to the stage, you know, coronavirus permitting, we can do some practical sessions. You like to see great generous slabs of brood, and with not too many cells unfilled between them. But because if it's very much a pepper pot appearance, it gets called, it can be an indication of disease. But there's a very interesting researcher in Germany called Jürgen Torz, and he feels that leaving a certain number of these cells here with empty means that you can actually, if the temperature within the hive drops, that adult workers can get in there and they can shiver their flight muscles and produce heat and actually warm the brood. Right, so the pupae have got to turn into adult bees, and here's 3 in a row, and you can see that already they're well on the way to changing, and they're beginning to look like adult bees rather than little maggoty larvae. And here's one coming out. It's done all the changes, and it's a perfectly formed adult worker bee. So the queen, once that egg, which is going to become a queen, is laid, it only takes 16 days before she hatches. And you would have thought, because she's perhaps in some ways more complex than others, it might take longer. But it's because she has this incredibly rich diet that they can produce a queen in that short time. When she first comes out, she has several days where she just gathers herself together, and it'll depend on the weather, but she's got to get out to mate within approximately a week to 10 days. And if she doesn't, if the weather's just frightful, then what happens is that the moment passes, she's no longer receptive, and the mating fails. And it means that obviously she's not got her lifetime supply of sperm in her spermatheca, and therefore, yes, she can lay an egg, but it can only be a drone. So, which obviously, it's the workers that do all the work, of course. And she mates only on that one occasion in her life, even though it might be with up to 15 drones. And she won't leave the hive except if the bees swarm. But we talk about swarming quite fully on other sessions. She doesn't feed herself. She has no hive duties. She is an egg-laying machine, and she lays eggs, and they wait on her, feed her, groom her, collect the queen substance, the pheromone, and generally do everything that she needs to have done. And she might well live between 3 and 5 years, but you know, it slightly varies. If they feel that she is flagging, perhaps she didn't mate very well, she can initiate a process, or rather the fact that she's failing initiates a process where she can be superseded. They can produce a new queen because, you know, she's not doing very well. Or if the colony builds up and it's really big and strong, it can trigger the point where it wants to create another colony as well, to change from one colony to being 2 different colonies. and that's swarming. So making a new queen. So they're going to make a queen, and the egg is selected before, usually it's 36 hours old. Several queen cells may be made, so they may produce more than one queen. In fact, they may produce a dozen or so if they're mad keen to swarm, and they can then possibly swarm a number of times. And the cell we've seen, which is horizontal, more or less, which the workers and drones are reared in, are very different to a queen cell. The queen cell is much larger and it hangs down, and that really, you know, triggers the behavior in the bees with the feeding, etc., to feed it in an appropriate way to make a queen. And it looks a bit like a peanut shell. It's all dimpled. And the larvae are fed a lot of royal jelly from the hypopharyngeal gland, and they're actually fed much more frequently than if there was going to be a worker. And if they've selected a considerable number of queen cells and they made them, perhaps the weather turns nasty, they can actually tear down certain of the queen cells and only take one or two on. So, you know, the fact that queen cells are built doesn't inevitably mean that they will actually come to fruition. And once more than one queen hatches, they will fight it out. They will fight to the death. Remember, they've got their sting with no barb on, and they will go at it hammer and tongs. And it's very much a case of last woman standing. So these are the little queen cups. You can see they're very different from the cells which you've seen before. They hang down, and obligingly the queen lays an egg in them. And but if it's an emergency situation, that they could actually convert one of these cells into one of these. But the queen cups hang down. And you can see they build them out. They're much, much bigger. They've got this lovely dimpled appearance, a bit like a peanut. And they're much, much bigger. And the queen larvae is up in there. And again, she's lying in a lovely puddle of dinner, royal jelly. And we can look up here and you can just about make out there's a larvae there. And she's lying in a puddle of royal jelly. On the 9th day, they seal the cell. They seal it over, and because she's got to actually pupate and become an adult bee, so on the 9th day she's sealed, and on the 16th day she will emerge, and the whole cycle will start again. So there she is, a beautiful picture of a queen, lovely. So you're going to play Spot the Queen now. I want you just to take a few moments to see if you can spot the queen on there. It's not that difficult to find her, but it can be tricky at times. But I'd like you to have a look and see where you think she is. Remember, her abdomen sticks out well past the end of her wings. And so, you know, you've had a chance. So there she is. I hope you all had a good chance of seeing her, and you'll find that you will get quite good at finding queens. One of the main things is they walk differently. I know it sounds strange. Their gait is different, and after a while, you don't find it too difficult to find them. And of course, if they have actually been marked, and so you've got that nice little marker on their abdomen, sorry, on their thorax, on the back of their thorax, it really does make it a lot easier. So here's our friend the drone. Now, fun enough, he takes 23 days to produce once the egg's laid, which is the longest of all. He's the male. He's got no sting, got no pollen baskets because he doesn't need it. He's a flying sex machine, and his only role is to mate with young virgin queens. So, and as you'd expect, he's got these big eyes, stronger wings, larger antennae, because he wants to be a pick up the pheromone from the virgin queens and tear off after her, hoping to mate with her. And in the warm part of the day in the summer, they fly to drone congregations, and you may have several hundred drones just flying around in a group. And it's some very interesting speculation on how they know that very often, year after year, the drone congregations are in similar areas, and yet, obviously, they're not the same drones. How do they know that this is a place to collect in? And very often a drone, if it turns up at a colony, not necessarily its own, they will let him in and he can top up with food and then go back and join the drone assembly, as the alternative name for a drone congregation. And they wait for young virgin queens on their mating flights. So the trouble is, from his point of view, if he successfully gets his genitals torn off and he dies, and under normal circumstances, his lifespan might be a maximum of 3 to 4 months, and he's forcibly evicted from the hive in late summer and dies. So if we have a look here, you probably recognize here is all the sealed brood, worker brood, and a drone is bigger, and the cells that they are bred in are bigger too. And so you can see this cell it's bigger. And so also the cappings stand up. Can you see they're domed instead of being flat like this, that they're actually domed up? And you can see there's one in there. You can see the larva in there. And so they're quite distinctive in the colony. You can always spot drone brood, and it's perfectly normal to have some in there for much of the time over the summer. This shows it even better. You've got a real area here of worker brood, sealed worker brood, and a big area here of the drone, and also over here. And you can see the difference. It's very characteristic. So here's our worker. That takes 21 days to come out after the eggs are laid. And as I say, her ovaries aren't developed, and under normal circumstances, she's infertile and won't lay eggs. And she does all the work. And classically, what you tend to think of is in the first 3 weeks, they do hive duties. They actually work within the hive. And then they spend probably 3 weeks as a forager bee out collecting nectar and honey. This is in the summer. And and it does vary a little bit, just depending on if there's a shortage of bees doing different functions. And most work themselves to death in the summer. But a different type of worker bee, in a sense, lives through the winter, where these are only designed really to live for 6 weeks in the summer. If they've got to get all these bees through the winter, in August they start producing workers that actually have much larger fat bodies in their abdomen. They're very rich in certain key substances. There's particularly one called vitellogelin, and this enables them to have on board a whole store of vital chemicals, which helps them get right through the winter. So winter workers might live 6 months, whereas in the summer they probably will live perhaps about 6 weeks. So as I say, here again, we've got the worker brood, you've got some pollen, and here you've got some sealed honey up here. So you've probably got quite used to seeing that nice biscuity color, and it's porous because it's got some pollen in it, which means that oxygen can diffuse through. So when they first come out, probably for a day or so, they don't necessarily do a great deal. It's all a bit of a shock, really, I imagine. And then they have these functions. So cell cleaning and general hive cleaning, moving on to feeding the brood. then they might be waiting on the queen. Not everyone would be, but they might be. Then they've got to process the nectar and make honey in the hive. Then they move on to wax production and comb building. And they may be fanning wildly because obviously they've got to try and keep the hive cool at the appropriate temperature, homeostasis, throughout the summer. For a lot of them, by the time they've got to this period, of course, they're beginning to start flying and then going foraging. But, you know, if it's necessary, they can be doing guard duty on the front door. And then from about 20 days to death, they're collecting nectar, pollen, propolis, and water. So, you know, they've got a lot to do. What tends to determine when they die is they wear their wings out. Their wings get very, very frayed. You'll see a worker bee towards the end of its working life, its wings are really quite frayed. Anyway, here's a beautiful forager. Got some pollen on its rear legs there, but beautiful picture, lovely flower. So that's the 3 types of bees. Here's our worker, one that does all the work. Our queen lays all the eggs, might be 2,000 a day, but you know, it's very likely that it's 1,000 and perhaps 1,500. And here's our drone, and he's you know, our flying sex machine. And you could have a look at this in this way. This is days down at the bottom here. And it's the development of the 3 types. So it takes 23 days to produce the drone. In fact, it's 21 for a worker, 16 for a queen. And it's the various stages of their life. And you will find that actually knowing this particular information is very helpful for you when you're keeping your bees. If we have a look at the lifespan, you can see that, you know, the drone does a little bit better than the worker, but you can see the queen, and this is again days at the bottom, that the queen does really live much, much longer than all the others. So let's look at our colony life cycle. And it is a self-perpetuating system. It's a cycle, as we've said. And if we say we'll start in this, with a cycle, you've got to start somewhere. So if you start with the swarm, so basically, what is a swarm? And we use the word advisedly. It has a quite specific meaning. But when a colony wants to split to become 2 colonies, then obviously what's got to happen, there's got to be a queen with the new colony and some workers and probably some drones as well. And they've got to be able to set up a new home. So what happens is that the queen actually builds queen cells, and when the queen cells get capped, that it's a warning sign to the old queen that if she lingers and doesn't actually go out with half the flying bees, that the danger is that the first of the virgin queens that comes out are going to fight to the death with her, and where I always think of her a little bit like sort of Queen Victoria in her middle years when she'd had about 8 children, and this athletic young virgin queen, obviously the chance of the old queen winning are pretty slender. And the bees actually start being rather nasty to the old queen. They don't feed her as much, so she stops egg laying. They nip her and push her about a bit and bully her. And eventually, when the magic moment comes, she flies out, and about 50% of the flying bees follow her. What is actually odd, but it's been proved, is that obviously you'd think, well, the flying bees, they're about 3 weeks old. But quite a lot of the bees that fly out with her may be much younger than that, only 10 days old. And although that obviously makes sense in that you want the bees that fly out with her to be as young as possible, because, you know, they've got to live until she has produced the eggs and the larvae and what have you, and the next generation comes on. It's a bit surprising that, you know, if you're a 10-day-old worker, all of a sudden, when normally you wouldn't be flying for another 10 days or so, you're joining in all the excitement and flying out with the Queen. And so what they've got to do is to build up. They've got to build a colony. Obviously, the Queen has got to produce enough eggs. They've got to build up the colony to be numerically, can't say that, sorry about that, and numerically strong enough to survive the winter, and also to have enough food to survive the winter. And the suggestion is that probably 75% of swarms, if they're left to do it naturally, you know, they haven't got assistance from beekeepers, will die in the first winter. So the loss rate is very high. Once they've set up the colony, if the Queen, you know, was beginning to flag a bit, they may supersede her, you know, they may replace her, but, you know, it's the old Queen that flies out. And eventually the colony builds up and up and up and up and probably overwinters, and then the next spring it starts the whole cycle again. And the old Queen leaves with a swarm. And the new Queen heads the colony. And it goes on over and over again. It all started with a swarm. There's a lovely prime swarm. The first one out, which obviously tends to be the biggest, is and the one most sought after. I was talking to one of the participants through email in the week about the joys of getting starting with a swarm, and obviously a swarm is free, and that the prime swarm is the first one out, and that's the one that you hope to get. It's got a lot of bees there. The Queen is safe, tucked away in the middle, and they tend to land on a bush or in a tree, and they then send out scouts, and the scouts fly to find somewhere good to live. Probably scouts have been scouting for a couple of days before, but what they do is the scouts fly out, and when they come back to the swarm, they do the bee dance, and we'll talk about the bee dance the other sessions. And the bee dance tells them where this new potential home is. Other bees go there, and if they think it's really good, when they come back, they do the same dance. And eventually you've got the majority of the bees on the outside are all doing the same dance. And at that moment, the swarm lifts off and flies there and moves in and starts the whole process again. So we're going to sum up. We've had a look at anatomy. We've had a look at the castes, all those developmental stages, the Queen, the workers, the drones, the colony life cycle. And now you've got the excitement of a teaser of what you're up to next week. So Stu will be taking it. I shall be at a parish council meeting agonizing about a communications mast at the top of the village. And here's a load of different hives that you can see being superimposed on each other. And Stu will talk about the respective merits of them all. And they've all got good points about them, but we do try and suggest to you that you do start with a basic orthodox hive until you've got some experience. There are some wild and wacky hives out there, and you know, it's probably our advice would be try not to go wild and wacky unless you really can't help yourself. Any questions?
Stop the screen share.
Okay. Am I mute?
Nope,
Do you want to
you're
take
not.
it?
Right, you're numbed into. No one appears to be asleep, which is always encouraging. I gave a talk to another group of
Said this last
beekeepers,
week.
you know, and I was, Chris, my wife was just saying, I'm sure you said this last week, but I'm going to say it again anyway. And it got terribly embarrassing because I said to the organizer, I really like to talk to someone. I don't want someone's face on the computer so I can talk to them rather than a blank screen. And so she was very good. She had herself up and I could talk to her and talk to the group and all was fine. And about 3/4 of the way through, she said, oh, I think she probably had to go off to put the greens on or something. And so she transferred it to an elderly gentleman who was actually, an elderly lady rather, I think was their president. And to my concern, not only did she initially fall asleep, but after a certain period of time, she appeared to stop breathing. And I became increasingly worried that should I be asking someone to nip round and bang on her door to make sure that she was still breathing. But there we go now. Oh, right. So we've got 2 people with their hands up. So Beth Lass, would you like to start? We'll get to you, Caroline Wood, I promise.
Tell her to unmute herself.
Can you unmute yourself, please? You have to unmute yourself.
Okay, can you hear me?
Lovely. Yep, that's
Hi.
great. Hi there.
How do you separate propolis from the honey? Do they?
Well, fun
Did I
enough, they're not mixed. Propolis is very much used for one task, and the honey is stored in the comb, and so the chance of getting propolis in your honey is infinitely small. So it's just not a problem. So
Okay.
yeah, it just never happens.
Okay, I just thought they looked like they were stuck together in that picture, but it's a separate area.
Yeah, it was just what
Okay.
I think with the 2 bits of wood pulled apart, it was just to demonstrate, particularly when it's warm, how sticky it is. But you know, it's not something that ends up in the honey.
Okay.
They sort of put
Thank
it
you.
everywhere else but, don't they? I mean, it's all over the frames, all over the boxes, and they just
Yeah.
don't put it in the cells. Sorry, Joe,
Right.
butting in there.
Okay.
Thank
So Beth, do you feel I've answered your question?
Yeah, I do. I'll mute myself again.
Oh no,
Thank you.
Lovely to hear from you.
Thanks.
Caroline, what would you like to say?
I'm a little unsure about how the drones mate with the Queen if they've been rejected from or died in the autumn. I think I'm getting the process right, but do they? So the Queen then lays more drones
That's right. What
following
happens is,
spring,
that's right.
and they then fly out to mate.
Yeah, what happens is that, as I was saying, there are no drones over the winter, but we'll know that when, you know, sort of March time comes and it begins to feel like spring, the Queen will actually lay some drone eggs, and the drones take that little bit longer. You remember, it's 23 days. And also then what happens is that what you've got to do is they're not actually sexually mature when they first hatch, when they first come out as adults. So it's really a couple of weeks before they're sexually mature. So, but they need to have sexually mature drones about, you know, if they're going to produce new queens. But yes, at the moment there aren't any.
Yeah. Okay.
So. So
you.
Garth Drazer, you've asked a question: when laying drone eggs, does the Queen lay a batch of them, or are they sped between the workers? In broad speaking terms, that you tend to get them in groups. You don't usually actually get them all jumbled up. What can happen is if a queen is getting towards the end of her life, and she's actually run out of, or is running out of sperm in her spermatheca, that she will start laying a lot more drones, and they can then get a bit disordered. And obviously it is of concern to beekeepers if all of a sudden your queen has run out of sperm in a spermatheca and is becoming a drone layer. So you know, that's the truth of it. But usually they are in discrete clumps, and as you can see, they do very much look different. Right, so have we got anybody else? So no one's under their desks saying, I'm not coming out till he's gone.
Can I ask a question, please?
Oh, certainly. Catherine, please do.
Yes. I'm just wondering, what happens to a swarm if something should happen to the queen that leaves with it? And so then they end up with no queen.
Right. Well, but basically it's the old queen, the experienced queen, the mated queen that flies out. And the reality is that it's very unusual for the queen to be either lost or to fail actually during that swarming process. And obviously, basically the bees want to be where she is. So if she flagged, let's say, and landed somewhere, they would all clump round her because they want to be with her. And when a swarm first comes out, you've got to remember that what they do is before they leave, they fill up with honey. So they are usually extremely good tempered. They're a bit like us when we've just had our Christmas dinner, you know, where we're feeling rather pleased with ourselves and extremely plump, and they're very good natured. So with a fresh swarm, there's really no need to feel anxious that they may well be huge and buzzy and, you know, 50,000 bees or goodness knows however they could be in a prime swarm. But they're usually extremely, you know, good, well-mannered. And the thing is, what happens is if the weather turns bad and they're stuck, you know, it's raining and they get stuck in a tree and they can't move on, and the whole process grinds to a halt. Over a period of 48 hours, they use up a lot of those stores. And like like us, if we're tired and hungry, we get a bit irritable and edgy. And that's when a swarm can potentially be quite aggressive and quite dangerous. But, you know, a new swarm isn't. So Tom White's put in a question. And I'll read it out. I mean, you're welcome to join in, Tom, if you'd like to. After an old queen leaves with the first swarm, will the colony to continue to send out other swarms? And if left to their own devices, will a colony eventually empty itself by swarming? Well, it does obviously depend a bit. If they really were big and strong and were, you know, really up for it, the prime swarm leaves, and that's, you know, 50% of the potential bees. So a few days later, as the other virgin queens come out, what tends to happen is the first virgin queen that comes out nips round to all her sister queens, and she actually, to intimidate them, keep them in their cells, she pipes, she squeezes her abdomen and makes a squeaking noise called piping. You don't hear it all that often, but it's nice when you do. And I think it's really to say, you better stay in your cells, girls, because otherwise it's curtains for you. And what she will do in certain circumstances, unless the worker bees stop her, she will sting her sisters through the side of the queen cells and kill all the others. What appears to happen is that sometimes or quite often, the workers will prevent her doing that. And so when the first of her sisters comes out, it's very likely that she will fly out and she will take 50% of the remaining bees, so which is 50% of 50. So it's much smaller than the prime swarm. And the difference with the second swarm out is it's got a virgin queen, she's not mated, and it's a smaller swarm. And obviously not only have they got to go through the process of finding somewhere to live, but as soon as they move in, what she's then got to do is fly out and mate. And there's a little bit of a delay after mating before she starts laying. So it's just another factor that slightly delays the build up of the colony. And obviously she's got far fewer workers than the prime swarm. And so it's stacked against her how well she's going to do if it's she's gone feral. But obviously if you've got her, you can help build them up, feed them, and make sure that the success. So, and of course, then what happens is the next queen that comes out will repeat the same. But again, there are fewer flying bees to go with her. And so you can end up with, after a while, the casts, and remember we call these little after swarms casts, is only the size of a grapefruit. Or so does that answer the question? Tom?
Yeah, it does. Thank you. I was just trying to really understand if sort of left to their own devices, do they eventually peter out to nothing, or will a colony shed swarms and look after itself at the same time?
There seems to be a preventive mechanism to actually usually self-destructing. So usually before they are terminally weakened, it does stop swarming. So so yeah, but it can happen that they appear to just swarm themselves to extinction. So Gary Brigden has asked, when the queen lays an egg, does she know what the egg will become, or is that up to the workers? Now the thing here is that and it doesn't show it all that clearly on the videos that we had, that when the queen comes to a cell, she measures the size of the cell with her front legs, and that tells her whether it's obviously a worker cell or a drone cell. And obviously if it's a queen cell, it's different again. If it's the worker size cell, obviously she has to put her abdomen down in and she lays a fertilized egg. And so she knows that she's going to lay a fertilized egg, and she allows that egg to be fertilized by some of the sperm, or a sperm from the spermatheca. If when she puts her front legs in and she feels the width of the cell, and obviously it's bigger, it's a drone cell, she then lays an unfertilized egg, and that obviously will then become a drone. So you end up with a drone in a drone cell. So it's unlikely that she will get it wrong. But obviously when you end up later on, occasionally you can have laying workers, that what happens is that, of course, it's completely random. Their eggs have got no sperm in their spermatheca. So they're all drones, and the whole thing becomes totally disordered and chaotic. Right. Oh, sorry. Do go on.
Does the queen have to fly out to be mated, or can they be mated in the cell?
No. Well, that's a very interesting question. Because, of course, you would think from the point of view of the safety of the queen, and ultimately, if it's the safety of the queen, it's the safety of the whole colony, that you would thought that evolution would have evolved a system where drones actually, crept in and mated with her so that she didn't have to go out. Because obviously the queen has never flown before. She flies out, and actually she flies out a distance. She may fly a mile away. And again, this very interesting German researcher, Jürgen Torz, I mentioned earlier, that he has this theory that actually some experienced foragers fly out with her, not so much to tell her where to go, but to try and get her home on the way back. And so she flies out, and she might fly for a mile. Drones have been gathering in these drone assemblies for, you know, they may have come from 5 miles away.
Other colonists.
When they actually have that magic moment, when they pick up the Queen's pheromone, they all fly after her, and obviously they then sequentially, one after the other, mate with her. And the mating, it's on the wing, and it's very transient. It only really, you know, seems to last for a few seconds. And by the time she's perhaps mated with 12, 15 of them, that she's taken on board all the sperm that she can carry. And then the thing that she's got to do is to get home. And if you imagine, she's never flown before, how, you know, why isn't it that more of them don't get lost? And Jürgen Torz feels that there are these foragers that help get her home. And back at base, actually outside the hive, you remember you saw the Nasonov gland, there are loads of bees with their Nasonov glands going, fanning wildly. They actually make it like almost like a roaring noise, because there are so many out there. And they're all fanning like crazy and sending out the pheromone that says, this is home, to try and maximize the chance that she's getting home. But obviously the reason why they do this is what the Queen wants is genetic diversity in her offspring. There are certain advantages to genetic diversity rather than inbreeding. And so although it's a very high risk strategy, and obviously there are some queens, perhaps they get lost, the weather turns nasty, they get picked off by birds. There are some queens that don't make it, but it's amazing how many of them do, considering they've never ever flown before. Right, so Melissa has got a question. Hi Joe, am I right in understanding that the prime swarm is the easiest for a new beekeeper, and that swarms later in the year would potentially have problems, particularly for a new beekeeper? And what are these problems other than being less time to prepare themselves for the winter? Okay, Melissa, sorry, can't see you at the moment, but thank you for the question. The thing is, obviously the prime swarm is the biggest, and it's got a proven queen. Admittedly, she's not in her first youth, and she's the earliest. So that, you know, obviously you're in with a very, very good chance. And, but of course, existing beekeepers that particularly if they've lost the odd colony over the winter, and 15% to 18% of colonies, managed colonies, die out every winter. It may be 75% in wild colonies. The beekeepers, if they can, will try and get the prime swarm. Now that doesn't mean, obviously, as I was talking to Elsie about this between sessions, that bees legally are what are called ferae naturae, and that's the Latin for wild creatures. And from medieval times, the convention is that while a beekeeper has their swarm or their runner has the bees in their sight, it still belongs to them. And when it lands, they can say, that's mine, you can't have it. But in fact, you know, if it flies off, they lose sight of it, they may have been out for the afternoon, they don't even know it's happened. And if someone comes across that prime swarm, obviously, you know, that's a huge bonus, and well done if you manage to do that. The thing is, the second swarm out, it's smaller and it's got a virgin queen. They tend to be more fidgety and restless, the second swarm. And, you know, it happens fairly regularly. Well, not regularly, but it does happen regularly enough that you get exasperated by it. That, you know, you pop them into your hive and you think, great, you know, we've got them. And it's a nice new queen. She'll go out and mate and settle down. And I've got a really good new queen. And obviously in their first year, they tend to lay more eggs than in their second year or their third year. And you think, great. And you go back 24 hours later and the hive's empty and they've all flown off somewhere else. Obviously their scouts had been choosing somewhere else, not where you want them to be. And so in that sense, it could be a little bit more disappointing. So Melissa, does that answer your question? Yeah, well I'll take it that it
Yes,
does.
yeah, she says yes, thanks.
Yeah, oh, she says so.
She sent a message, Joe.
Yeah,
She-
seen it now.
She
Yeah.
she did send a message that she said, thank you for, that is an answer.
Right, so long as it's the answer she wanted, that's the main thing. Sorry, my cat's turned up, but this is Molly. Say hello, Molly. Lionel, who just spoke, I was informed during the week, he's a good friend and someone I've known a good many of years, that he was trying to prime one of his local beekeepers who's on the course to ask me an improbably difficult question that I was almost certainly not to know the answer. So I was going to allow it to happen, but it hasn't actually happened. But
Wild rumours, Joe, wild rumours.
oh, it was not wild rumours. Sorry about this, Arnold.
Joe,
Hi there.
could I return to the question that Catherine was asking earlier about what happens when the queen disappears in the swarm?
When it just
No,
disappeared.
it's a story. I was told a couple of years ago by one of our beekeepers.
Oh, right.
That a swarm left his hive, and he could see a swallow go into the swarm, and it clearly took the queen because the swarm scattered.
Hmm.
But most of them actually went back to the mother hive.
Yeah.
But it was quite an
One of the
interesting
things-
tale.
One of the things which more experienced beekeepers do is that, and in fact, I didn't draw attention to it, which perhaps I should. One of the queens we saw had actually had she was a clipped queen. And what you can do is it's only on one wing and you snip off about the end third of the wing. And the reason you do it, you create this asymmetry and they find it difficult to fly. And they can fly a bit often, but they don't go very far. And classically, what they tend to do is when they're going to swarm, is that the bees and the queen, they all rush down the flight board, and the queen leaps in the air and plop, she falls in the grass just in front of the hive, and all the bees race off and swirl around in the air. And a few of them realize, actually where she is, and that they then go back and look after her and feed her and love her and generally keep her safe. And after a while, all these bewildered bees actually, tend to go back into their hive where they came out of. When I first started bees back in the early 1970s, that what happened was that our chairman was Dr. Campbell, and he was elderly Scot, as the name suggests, and he worked at the Geological Institute in Kensington, and he kept his bees on the roof there, and he used to work with clipped queens, and he was busy during the day, and occasionally his bees would actually swarm, and they would come out of the hive. The queen would race down the flight board, hurl herself into the air and go plop onto the sort of bitumen flat roof of the Geological Institute. And this swarm of bees would swirl down into, I think it was Kensington High Street. And it was obviously tended to be in the summer months, absolute chaos would reign, people diving into shops, and people in open top cars and what have you would be abandoning their cars and just rushing into shops thinking that chaos and Armageddon was upon them. And people would ring the police and say, you've got to get down here quickly. It's absolute chaos. There's a traffic gridlock, and a swarm of angry creatures are setting about everybody. And of course, after about 5 or 10 minutes, the bees would think mum's not here, and they would all go back up into their colony, and the police would turn up, and all the bees had gone, and there would just be all these rather foolish-looking people with their noses pressed against the glass of the shops down Kensington High Street, and they never ever worked out quite where all these bees came from. And Dr. Campbell, that he would then he would, you know, when he'd finished work, he would go up and he'd scoop up the queen, and he would do whatever maneuver was necessary for, you know, to sort things out. But there we go. So yes, you can have fun with clip queens. I got sort of verbally savaged by an insect rights activist at a talk I gave to Transition Bath once, and she accused me of cutting the wings off queen bees, and it was all terribly painful and hurt them, and it was showed my depravity and wickedness. And and she brought some of her mates along, so I almost got debagged in the Transition Bath, but I managed to convince her in the end that actually that wasn't something that I personally, in fact, I don't work with clip queens at all. So any more questions? You're welcome to.
Verbal questions.
Do say if you would like to.
But don't forget, you've got to unmute yourself if you're trying to verbally ask a question.
Yeah, I can't see everybody in the gallery, so if you're making wild gestures, I can only see a few. Oh, no.
Thank you for an interesting evening.
Good. Well, I hope you liked it, and we look forward to...
I've got to go and have a lay down now. It's been too much.
Well, I think that's a good principle. Just make yourself think, well, at least I'm not a drone.
I do have one more question I just saw on the notes.
Yes, certainly, Catherine.
When we were talking more about the worker, you said that they're fed a special diet to fatten them up for the winter.
That's right. In August.
The workers get fed a special diet to fatten them up for the winter. So that's
right.
Yeah. Is that once they've come out and they're a worker bee, or do they get fed this whilst they're in the cell?
It's actually in the cell, but I think, you know, that it's then reinforced actually when they're outside. There's this particular chemical, vitellogelin, they're often fatty acids, and it is called the fat body, but it's not, you know, just adipose tissue. It's this rich source of a cocktail of nutrients.
It comes from the pollen, a lot of it, Joe.
Yeah.
They tend to consume only honey during the main part of the summer, but towards the end, the newer bees being created in late August and September eat pollen, which is normally only fed to the larvae. And that pollen contains protein and fats and all sorts of other things, minerals. And that's what produces the vitellogenin and the fat body.
Yeah, so, you know, it's, and it's one of the useful things to remember that pollen is the protein source. You know, nectar is the carbohydrate, but it's pollen all the time, which is the great pollen, is the great protein source.
Interesting fact number 236, the queen is only ever fed honey. She's not fed pollen at all. And because of her high usage of energy, the one thing the queen doesn't do, unless she goes out to swarm or to be mated, is go to the loo. She doesn't actually need to, because she's using up all her energy.
Now that's a thought, isn't it?
Thought
for the day. There we go. Well, I think we've probably come to an end. I mean, you're very welcome to ask any more questions.